At the southernmost tip of the African continent, we find a land rich in history, with diverse cultures, and pivotal in the evolution of human civilizations. Like the rest of the world during the 18th century, South Africa had its own encounters with foreign European nations. But first, let's go back to the times when the southern African population was at its prime, living in peace and harmony, exploring the ways of the world at their own pace. Pre-colonial South Africa was inhabited by various indigenous tribes, most significantly the San and Khoi ancient tribes who left their marks on their land. All tribes had their own separate communities where they lived comfortably with their own traditions and customs. However, that all came to a halt as soon as Europe found its way to that pure land. So come along as we explore the fascinating and complex history of South Africa, covering everything from the significant transformations brought about by British control, as well as investigating the perspectives and impacts on both parties of this era. This is a tale of perseverance, adjustment, and the South African people's unwavering spirits. Now, how did Europe find out about that treasure of a land? Well, back during the age of exploration of the late 15th century, Portuguese explorers needed to find an alternate way to reach Asia since the Mediterranean Sea was blocked off by Italian powers. Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama was the first to land on the southern tip of the African continent, setting up rest stops to reach Asia and its hidden treasures. Sooner than later, that rest stop developed into trading posts that allowed the African population their initial access to the outside world of trade. However, no permanent settlements have spoiled that pure African soil just yet. That was until the Dutch East India Company established a supply station at the Cape of Good Hope in 1652, marking the beginning of permanent European settlements. The Dutch settlers, or Boers, expanded inland and initially traded with the Khoi people, but tensions over land and resources led to conflicts. The Khoi resisted the expansion of Dutch settlements, leading to a series of wars known as the Khoi-Dutch Wars. In 1806, the British occupied the Cape Colony, and by 1814 it was formally ceded to Britain. Their arrival caused the Boers of Cape Colony to seek new regions to inhabit as a result of the growing tensions, and so they would lead numerous expeditions inland to find their new homes. The British brought significant changes, both positive and negative, that would alter the course of South African history for generations and centuries to come. South Africa was seen by the British as a country with significant strategic, geographical, and economical potential. Located at the crossroads of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, the Cape Colony was crucial for maintaining naval supremacy and protecting sea routes to India and the East Indies. The Cape also provided vital refueling stations for British ships, ensuring control over key maritime routes essential for trade and military movements. In addition, the fertile lands of the Cape offered agricultural opportunities as well as mining companies that took advantage of the abundant natural resources in the area, introduced new agricultural practices, and constructed infrastructure such as ports and railroads, but the local community paid a heavy price for these modifications.
Killed. Villages were destroyed. Political systems were completely destroyed. Leaders were arrested, put in jail.
British colonization had a profound impact on the environment. Large areas of land were cleared for habitation and agriculture, upsetting the natural ecosystem of the area. The discovery of gold in 1886 and diamonds in 1867 led to mining booms that permanently changed the landscape and degraded vast areas of the environment. Not to mention the Berlin Conference of 1884 that set up its own borders, disregarding of the people it has split apart and the lands it has permanently marked. British colonization provided new kinds of government and administrative systems to politics, frequently keeping Africans out of meaningful participation. The British introduced a centralized colonial government, imposing their legal and political systems. Conflicts over political dominance and resources sparked multiple wars, like the Anglo-Zulu War and the Xhosa Frontier Wars. British control also had a significant social influence on indigenous communities. African communities were uprooted as a result of British policy favoring European colonization. Traditional patterns of life were disturbed and land was seized. Indigenous cultures and languages were further diminished by the establishment of British legal and educational institutions. The establishment of racial segregation in schools is one of the most lingering effects of British colonial control. White and non-white children received significantly different resources and facilities in segregated schools. Policies of racial discrimination that would eventually be formalized under apartheid were made possible by this segregation. The differences that were made during this time period had a part in the long-term inconsistencies in educational opportunities and quality that exist in South Africa among various racial groups until today. The education of the existing South African populations introduced the concept of the white man's burden, which also seems to be the title of the poem by Rudyard Kipling. The poem provides the audience with the perspective of the British missionaries when it was their time to educate and civilize the South African population upon their arrival. Kipling describes the African population by calling them half devil and half child, which implies that not only were they childish and immature in their actions, but also devilish and savages. That they were initially beasts that they had to take the time and effort to tame, and that they should be thanked and appreciated for doing so. Kipling also writes, "Impatience to abide, to veil the threat of terror," basically stating that the task of educating and civilizing these populations will require patience and bravery that only the colonizers were capable of. The author then attempts to justify the multiple wars and conflicts that both parties will endure, writing the savage wars of peace, claiming that the bloody and violent wars they inflicted on those underdeveloped communities were for their own gain in the long run, to achieve peace in the lands they rule as they conquest further inland, to achieve peace among the populations that they invaded. This poem successfully provides the audience with a detailed perspective of the British colonizers who had to allegedly civilize the uncivilized populations they encountered, hence the white man's burden.
Africans wanted to trade right from the word go. They wanted to sell their labor. From Malawi and northern Rhodesia, they used to go down into South Africa. You had a movement of people. People wanted to learn. They wanted to meet each other. So it was a natural thing that the outside world should get involved with Africa.
But it is imperatives such as this one that can cause very dangerous impacts on the audience, as readers may believe these claims without taking into consideration the other perspective, the colonized perspective. Which is why it's also important to acknowledge African authors and writers, as their works defy the dangers of a single story. Up from Slavery, Slaves at the Cape, Their Origins, Treatment and Contribution, a historical book by Richard E. van der Ross, is a great example of historical works that accurately and effectively interpret the colonized perspectives of those historical events. In this book, van der Ross highlights the harsh realities of slavery, noting, "Slaves at the Cape were subjected to severe treatment, often facing brutal punishment and dehumanizing conditions." Van der Ross also discusses the positive impact of the slaves on the Cape society, writing, "The contributions of slaves went beyond mere labor. They were skilled artisans, builders and craftsmen, whose work laid the foundations for many of the Cape's infrastructures." Overall, the book offers a comprehensive exploration of how slaves, despite facing significant adversities, played an integral role in the economic and cultural development of the Cape Colony. The detailed accounts of their origins, treatment, and contributions provide a deep understanding of their impact on South African history and their perspective as they were enslaved and treated poorly.
Contact was a contact of inequality. In other words, we were made to believe as if we had no civilization, no culture. That was very traumatizing indeed.
We are reminded that the implications of imperialism remain relevant today when we consider the violent history of British colonization in South Africa. Even though there are still many wounds from the past, South Africa has started a process of healing and rebirth. As a result of its citizens' suffering and victories, the country has accepted equality, democracy, and diversity as guiding ideals for the future. As a monument to the endurance of its people and the strength of unity in diversity, South Africa is a light of hope in the world today, paving a route towards a brighter tomorrow. The country navigates its post-colonial problems with a spirit of optimism and determination, as we see it today.